Item 14 is our submission on the Local Government Regulatory Systems Amendment Bill, and Alf and I were terribly excited to read this report. It's a riveting report, and we've asked Warwick to lead us through in great detail, and I do have to apologise to Warwick. I thought we would just take this as read, but there are a couple of really critical issues in here that I think deserve to be pointed out. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. So the Regulatory Systems Amendment Bill is an omnibus bill that addresses a number of usually minor technical issues in various statutes. When we became aware of it, or the Council became aware of it, a call was put out to staff as to who felt that the Council needed to make submissions on any matters in the bill, and generally there's general happiness, comfortableness with what's in the proposals, but there are some points being made through Democracy Services and also in terms of alcohol control bans. So the submission firstly addresses the proposals in the bill and then adds some additional from Auckland Council. The key one that we're interested in, particularly from Democracy Services, is the provision that's proposed for the Local Electoral Act, which creates a mandate to promote elections. So at the moment, there have been comments being made through the Select Committee inquiry into election after election about how voter participation is dropping off and someone needs to do something about it. So this is a clear statement that there is a duty to promote elections. Our issue is that the proposal puts that duty with the electoral officer, and some councils in New Zealand, ourselves included, actually contract the electoral officer, and it'd be more appropriate to lay the duty with the local authority. Then there are some proposals to do with what's meant by public notice. At the moment, the definition in the Local Government Act and Local Government Official Information and Meetings Act is that a public notice is a notice in the newspaper circulating in the area. The bill proposes that added to that is a requirement that a public notice is also placed on a council's website. We do that anyway, so we're happy to support that. But what we are doing in the submission is pointing out that there are some creeping inconsistencies in definitions about public notice. So in the RMA, for example, there's a requirement to give a summary with the details on the website. There's a legislation bill going through the House at the moment which gives as a definition of public notice either in a newspaper, either on the website, or either in the Gazette. And we just felt we should point that out so that the Select Committee could perhaps think about some more consistency there. There's another proposed change to naming of meetings. So you'll recall that we have what are called extraordinary meetings, and in the current provisions for extraordinary meetings, there's a provision to call an extraordinary meeting with 48 hours notice or with a day's notice. 3 days notice or a day's notice. So what the proposals in the bill are doing is recognising that second provision, an urgent meeting will be called an emergency meeting. We're not quite sure why they're introducing that, but we don't have a problem with it.
It's urgent, it's going to be urgent.
And that brings us to proposals to add to the bill. And the first one in your report is to do with temporary alcohol bans, and that would be time for me to suggest that Paul explains to you what that's about.
So through you, Madam Chair, the Local Government Act provides two ways to make alcohol bans. They can be made in a bylaw itself, or they can be made in a resolution pursuant to a bylaw. That is the way that the Council has approached the making of alcohol bans. It is a bit more flexible and a bit more responsive way to make alcohol bans. The Act provides the criteria that Council must be satisfied of in making those decisions. And in relation to permanent alcohol bans, that criteria is the same. You need to have high levels of evidence of alcohol-related crime or disorder, and the bans need to be appropriate and proportionate in relation to that evidence. But when the problem becomes for temporary alcohol bans, here the criteria is different, and this is the point that staff consider is contrary to the intent of the Act. So you all know for temporary alcohol bans for large-scale events, the alcohol-related problems that occur aren't related to the location, but it's related to the event itself. So if we put a temporary alcohol ban in the bylaw, we can say regardless of where this, it doesn't matter that whether there's evidence of alcohol-related crime or disorder in relation to the location. This is an event that could attract alcohol-related harm, and we're putting a temporary ban in place. There's no need to be satisfied that there's evidence of prior harm. So this supports the police, who are most of the times the requester for these types of alcohol bans as part of their prevention first approaches. The problem comes though when we want to make an alcohol ban by resolution. The criteria in the Act as it currently stands requires us to have prior evidence of harm at the location, which gives rise to a lot of difficulties, and it's on this point that we're suggesting that you make a submission to say that we need to align the criteria so that we can make temporary alcohol bans by resolution, and in the same way that we have the criteria for temporary alcohol bans in the bylaw itself.
Okay. Any others?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We might go all the way through and then just go back and ask questions on those specific issues, if people are comfortable with that.
I should note that some of these comments actually come through the work that Solgum's done and is common to a number of councils making submissions. So the next one to add is about election advertising and social media. That's just to create some consistency with definition in the Electoral Act, and so that it's quite clear that if you like a post on Facebook, you don't need to have your post or your liking authorised under the local Electoral Act. Then there's a submission to do with making supplementary roles and deletions files available to the electoral officer. Citizenship of candidates. The local Electoral Act currently requires every candidate to be a citizen. But the only proof of that at the moment is a declaration on the candidate nomination form that the candidate is a citizen. There was recently a case in Whangarei where a person was elected to the council, found out later that they were not a citizen, and that created a vacancy. So this proposal makes it a requirement to provide proof of citizenship. And then lastly, an issue to do with matai titles. So that was a question that came up at the last elections. The current provision in the local Electoral Act is that titles are prohibited. That raises a question of, well, are matai titles prohibited as well? They're called titles. There's a register of titles in Samoa, but our understanding is that matai titles really used very much the same as a name, although they have some special meaning. In this submission, we're asking that the Select Committee inquire into it rather than suggesting a particular change to the local Electoral Act. Solgum have pointed out to us that there's crossovers between the local Electoral Act, the Electoral Act and the Birth, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act as to what constitutes a name. And so we're just wanting to keep that issue alive so someone looks into it.
Okay, so happy to take questions. Richard?
And sorry if I've missed the boat on this, but I'm concerned about the citizenship requirement. I think that is a massive barrier to people standing. I assume you need a passport, would you, potentially? But I'll just finish my concern. I think a declaration is enough. We don't make people show ID to vote. We trust that 99.9999% of the time people are genuine about that. The declaration allows it to be legal, and we can act on that if people are purposely going out of the way. If there's only been one example of that happening, I don't see it as a reason to change. But I would be concerned there'd be a lot of people in our communities that don't have passports or access to their information, but would like to stand for council. I mean, yeah, I have some real concerns around if we make it too hard, we're just going to have the same people being able to stand. It's not because I think people shouldn't have to prove, but a declaration should be enough, and the challenge in there is around a fine or a police action if people lie. So I just worry forcing people to have that as something we shouldn't be advocating for.
Just clarify what kind of thing people would need? What is the thing that proves that you're a citizen apart from a passport?
Passport or birth certificate. We haven't actually inquired into the detail of that. But perhaps, just to recognise that there are pros and cons around this, and on Councillor Hill's side, one of the issues that we see is that if it's a requirement and it's part of the nomination process, then if that proof isn't provided by 12 noon on the day that nominations close, then the nomination would probably not be accepted. So it does actually provide that sort of barrier.
Okay. I think if the ability to access proof, if the barriers were lowered on that, then it would get over the problem.
But in my view, I wouldn't know where my birth certificate was right now. I mean, I could probably access it, and I need to get a new passport. But if I didn't have one, which a lot of our community have never travelled overseas, but they should be able to feel free to stand, I just think that a statutory declaration is enough, and I don't think there's the evidence to say it's a problem that needs a change.
Very good.
Okay. So that's something we could feed in, because this is our feedback on the Act. I mean, people know that I've been born in South Africa. I get challenged most elections with the Taxpayers Union requiring my proof of citizenship or whatever, and I just photocopy my passport yet again. So, you know, it does become an issue. If you're New Zealand born, that's fine, but for us foreigners, it can become quite a point of stress and tension. But on the other hand, the burden of proof is actually on the person standing, and there's a certain responsibility that comes in putting a name forward for office. So I think we need to work out how we can resolve some of those barriers. Other comments? Councillor Cooper?
Yeah, I suppose I've got a different view, because if you're a citizen, we know that we go to citizenship ceremonies and everybody gets their certificate, and so you don't have to have a passport.
But you would.
Hang on, you've had your turn.
Let's just listen.
No, so you do have it. You get given it, and you can always get copies. But I think, to me, it's also part of that thing that if you're going to stand, there needs to be a certain level of responsibility to be an elected person anyway. And if you can't even find your birth certificate, you just go and get a copy, and that's the reality of it. You've got to find the $120 or whatever it is to put your name forward. I just think, you know, even one by-election, what is it about? How many ratepayers' dollars is one by-election?
100,000.
It's how much would one by-election be for one person? About 100,000 or something like that? I know for the licensing trust it's about 50 or 60.
But we don't make people.
Yeah, so I think if you can stop that happening, it stops disruption as well. It's not, and we're not making the decision, we're suggesting, and I don't think personally, I don't think it's a barrier.
Can we pick up the point rather
So I
than
don't-
try and overlay this now or overthink this now? I think I probably
I agree with the
agree with
submission.
Councillor Cooper on this one.
Yeah.
However, I think the point that you're making, Councillor Hills, is let's be very sensitive to the barriers that this might present, and let's make sure that the process by which the proof is presented, that the barriers are well understood, identified, and that there's a process in place to make it easy.
Yeah. We don't have to give ID to vote or enrol to vote.
No.
I'm just wondering,
Voting is a bit different from being a governor.
Person.
We could include a note in the submission that the council notes its concern that
Yeah.
requiring proof of citizenship should not be a barrier to
Yeah.
participating in the elections as a candidate.
No, I think that's well made. Okay, Councillor Collins.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on that as well, but I think we've reached a good point in the line that Warwick is looking at adding. I just wanted to add as well, I think one of my concerns around the citizenship issue is if you look at the evidence around the participation of migrant communities and Indigenous peoples, there's always an unease around their citizenship documentation. So I just think that's important to note. I don't know if I'm conflicted in saying this, but I'm glad that we've kind of reached a middle point with regard to Mate titles. When I stood for office, I only had my Mate title or name on the banner, but never used it on the actual voting form. And I think we've got to reach some kind of compromise, because I know that it is much more of a name than it is a title. But I guess the New Zealand kind of trying to translate what that name means, title was the best use of the word. So I just think it's been summed up really well here. I definitely know that within the community, they really want the ability to use those names because they associate with our village backgrounds and our ngafa. I don't know what the Palangi word is, genealogy, like where you, your family tree. So I think that's really important. So well noted here, and hopefully we will reach some kind of compromise so that people can use their names. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's good to know. Councillor Casey.
Like the chair, I've been told to get back on the boat as well and have my passport to hand each election. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the social media section in light of the recent controversy with Pauline Kingy losing her chair of the committee over 23, what do you call them? So LinkedIn,
Yeah.
Oh, whatever. I can't remember what you call them. Endorsements. 23 endorsements of Wally. I mean, I would have no idea who's endorsed me or who have I endorsed. LinkedIn was something I did a long time ago. But the this is what was the thing I was gonna say? It was about it was about buying likes. Now I've never bought a like on Facebook, I swear. But I know that you can buy likes, and so just before we leave this, because I support everything that's in the report, including this. But Warwick, can you tell me anything about buying Richard, buying likes? Because you can buy likes, and if you buy likes, that's actually different from people genuinely liking. Got that?
No,
Yeah.
It's a slightly tangential discussion, I think.
No, this is whether likes is considered election advertising.
So let's just be clear. We're saying, I think the point was, if I like something, do I have to, during the election time, put a authorised by blah, blah, blah?
Yeah.
But I think you're asking if, as a candidate, you buy likes to raise your profile, is that something you would have to declare as part of your election expenses? Is probably the.
I think that's about it. It's not to do with Facebook and likes. What the proposal's trying to do is arrive at a definition of election advertising. And so a post on Facebook then is not considered election advertising, but if you have advertising that you pay for, that's bought advertising, then that is election advertising. If it says, please vote for me.
But what if you have a post and then you buy likes? That's exactly what the chair just said.
Advertising. That's
You buy likes, and so you promote your post.
No, you don't buy the
I
likes.
think
you
what
buy
we might
advertising.
be straying into is a bit of the what's classified as election expenses or stuff that you may have to raise. And I think we can just add that to the big pool of social media changes every 3 years. Are we keeping up? Are we keeping pace with the stuff people will need to declare? Yeah, no, that's well raised, Councillor Casey. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting discussion. I have two questions. Firstly, because I support what Richard Hills has said in relation to proof of citizenship, I don't support recommendation 6. Can you just clarify, at the making of a nomination, if the person nominating has to sign a statement, a statutory document, make a statutory declaration in relation to their identity and credentials anyway, and that statutory declaration is one where if they're falsifying information that they're going to be in trouble. Can you confirm that?
The current practice, the law requires the candidate to be a citizen, and different councils, as I understand it, have different practices, and some actually do require proof. Our practice here and it's fairly standard practice, I believe, is that, so the nomination form is presented by two nominators, but it's also signed by the candidate, and the bit which the candidate signs includes a signature alongside a statement to the effect that they are a citizen.
Yeah, so
That's
the onus is on the person making a declaration
Yes.
that they are who they are, and falsifying information and signing that gets them potentially into some trouble. So I don't see the mischief that we need to resolve as recommendation 6. That's the first thing. So I don't support recommendation 6, Chair. The other question I had, and it's a bit, last time, some of the information that we were advertising, my opponent started to buy social media sponsorship of that information to broadcast. In other words, my opponent was spending money on advertising statements that I had made, and I got to the point of worrying about whether I actually needed to go and ask them for an account of how much they were spending for my declaration, because they were promoting my information. So how does that get picked up? Because if you've got third-party advertising that you actually haven't sanctioned, but it is fundamentally assisting you, I don't want to be in a situation whereby I'm not declaring information which is actually sourced from me, but actually promotes me.
I think
you just say
the
thank you very
intention
much.
of
Well,
of the
I'd
legis-
like to, but I'm not sure I can.
the intention of the legislation is to put a cap on what candidates spend themselves on promoting themselves for election. If someone else promotes you for election, that's not captured.
They need to have an authorisation statement though, and they need to.
If it's an opponent trying, I think we are
It's
getting a little
not
bit
really-
broad here. If it's an opponent trying to knock you down by taking apart what you're saying, but broadcasting the words you've used and using your name, that's politics 101, you know, don't do that. So you benefit, but I don't think you pay. Are we missing any other points we need to pick up? Richard?
I'm not sure if it's covered by this, but it just sprung to mind, and you can't buy likes, but we can go into that later if you want, Kathy. There was a complaint made against me during the last campaign to the Electoral Commission and to the police because someone tagged their ticked voting paper, tagged me in the post, so I was technically promoting a completed ballot paper. The police rang me in the end and said it was obviously political because it had come from an opponent. But what they also said, the law hasn't kept up with the social media. Is that captured? Because a lot of people do go, I voted for blah, 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 and put up their completed ballot paper on social media or Facebook. It's not like when you're in a booth and you're not allowed to take pictures within the booth. But because the police at the time said to me, look, don't worry, but...
Madam Chair, I think we'd need to look into that. The idea of having your vote totally private is to avoid coercion, and if someone chooses to publicise their vote, I don't think there's an issue, but perhaps we could look at that offline.
How they do that,
Yeah.
sorry, Madam Chair.
Okay, well brought up. Oh, right, Councillor Simpson, Councillor Philippina, and then I think we're probably done. Councillor Simpson.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that last discussion. It's more how they do that, and they should not be able to tag the person who's potentially the candidate that's standing, or if they do, I totally support what Richard's saying. And I mean, what your inverted friends who don't pay to be friends or like you want to do is they want to say, hey, I've supported you, isn't that fantastic? And I suppose it's a wider conversation with a wider group. You can put all the law you like, but if people don't know, and it's just the use of social media. I just don't think this is strong enough in the use of social media. I think it needs a little bit more consideration and work by people who know social media probably a lot more than myself.
Just reflecting on this conversation, I think there's a real point in here to be made around the social media as a thread that needs to be picked up in and of itself. Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay, Councillor Philippina.
Thank you, Chair. Warwick, I'm interested to see whether there's any criteria that identifies a large-scale event. This is in regards to the temporary alcohol bans. The reason I say that is because, one, I'm glad that we have made the amendment for this, because as you know, Paul, when we went through the alcohol bans and what ends up going into the new council, and we had to revisit the issue that all our local boards had of getting the police to justify keeping those alcohol bans as permanent. So, I mean, this is a very good step, but is there any criteria to say this is a large-scale event and this temporary alcohol ban criteria will be applied to these?
So through the chair, yeah, it's an interesting discussion that we've been having with a lot of the smaller districts as well. It was the point that they brought up, because you know what's where the discussion got to was what large scale is kind of open to a bit of interpretation and leeway, because what's large for one is going to be small for another, perhaps.
Certainly.
But we did get to a point where we thought that the large scale was relative, and so if you're in the far north and you've got an event that's attracting 1,000, that's still large scale. Just because you're in Auckland, it doesn't mean that large scale must mean a threshold of 10,000.
Yeah.
So there's no actual threshold for it. And if it was ever taken to task, the courts would just apply what is a reasonable person would consider. So we think we can apply the term large scale to things such as music and movies and parks, if it needs be, all the way through to our large concerts like Fleetwood Mac and AC/DC.
Okay, just supplementary, please, Chair. So the making of the temporary alcohol bans, with the changes that has been recommended in this item, the ability, and please refresh my memory, but the ability to make alcohol bans, whether it be temporary or not, they lie with region or with the local board?
So there's shared decision making, or different parts of the governing Auckland Council are given delegated authority. So the regulatory committee has responsibility for things of regional significance.
Yes.
And local boards have responsibility for all of their local areas. And then we have the Auckland Domain Committee, which is the special authority.
So they would use, sorry, Chair, because the local boards, I mean, they were up in arms when we ended up having to go through a whole new process around keeping the alcohol bans permanent. Because a lot of the local boards that I spoke to across the region said this is wrong, that we're doing this. As in, we have to get evidence. If we don't, there's no more ban, no more alcohol ban. So the local boards could use it for a park that's under their jurisdiction.
In relation to an event, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Right, it's been moved and seconded. I want to thank everyone for their thoughtful questioning, and thank you for bringing this to us. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Good work.
Yes.
Yeah, can I just note I don't support recommendation 6?
Oh, sorry, which recommendation? C?
6. Me too, thanks. That's on the proof of citizenship.
Okay. Yep. All right.
Noted.
Yep, note.
Yep.
Got it, and that's... Awesome. So the last item on the open agenda is the information items, which we've done, and item 16 is in confidence, so I will just move that, and Councillor Filipaina will second, as this is around the